Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 169 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. My name is Billy Bob. I am on the left coast, and it's morning for me. It's almost a little bit after 9 a.m. I've got my regular co-host, Ian Kummer. He is streaming live from a suburb in Moscow. And I've got two special guests. First special guest is Phil Rockstroh, streaming live from Atlanta, Georgia. And I've got other special guest, Greg Rosen, streaming live from Chicago, Illinois. So this is episode 169. I have entitled it, The Intersectionality of Ideology and Current Events. And that's a pretty broad topic. It seems like every day this is what we're discussing. And, you know, before we get started, I wanted to make two basic points about ideology. First, I wanted to kind of explain how I see ideology and what ideology means to me. And I kind of, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. I wonder who is
that me?
It might be, yeah, it might be Ian.
I will mute when I'm not talking. How's that?
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of describe. It might be okay. I think it might have been Phil also. So I just muted Phil, but I'm going to unmute Phil when he's going to be talking. But so that's better. Okay, so ideology. I stole this concept from Caleb Maupin. I like Caleb. He's a great analyst. But he kind of describes ideology as a roadmap, and it shows us where we've been. We can kind of see where we're at, and we can look forward and try and figure out, you know, the best way to get to where we want to go. And so for me, that's a great way to kind of, understand ideology. And so it says something about history, you know, and through that understanding of history, it allows us to kind of, you know, figure out where we are at. And then it kind of gives us an idea of where we want to go and how to get there. So, okay, having said that, my last point about ideology is that there is nobody who is non-ideological. So if you're fooling yourself and think that, oh, I'm not ideological, you know, ideology is for other people, like that's just not how it works. Everybody has certain assumptions and a certain perception, and that's what, you know, your ideology is. And if you're unaware of those, you know, biases and assumptions that you have, that just means you haven't really thought about it too much. But okay, those were the two main things. And so, okay, last thing, let me just say this. I think we are living in the most important and crazy and interesting times of the last 75 years for sure. And I think it's more important now than ever, kind of to talk about these things, to understand what's happening, and to try and, you know, figure out what is the best way to understand and perceive these events that are going on, that are really starting to accelerate, and that are going to have huge, important effects on, you know, the next 100 years of our existence. So having said that, who wants to talk down and run with it? Because I don't want to keep on and explain my ideology. So I'm sure somebody has thoughts. Phil, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share about? Shoot! Oh, I've muted Phil. That's the problem. Phil, let me unmute you, and then we can hear you.
Okay. Well, what I associated was Woody Guthrie saying all songs are political. That, you know, people claim they have a non-ideological song. They're still in the ideology of, let's say, corporate consumerism, if they want to sell a lot of records. There is an ideology, and since we live in a capitalist system, that's the waters we swim in. Even if we rebel against that, even if we consider ourselves anti-consumer, we've read read Marx. We have an understanding of the immense failure, the catastrophe of capitalism, and we come from a non-capitalist basis. we still have not shorn ourselves of that. And I think we have to be aware of that shadow aspect of ourselves as leftists. And because we're going to have to deal with it. We leave the house. You know, I have a 12-year-old son, and since we've come back from Germany, he has to negotiate this world of appliances you use when I go out to the store. In Germany, they still have, you know, the old-fashioned methods of using cash and maybe a credit card on occasions. So I'm always being bombarded with the novelty that capitalism exists in, because we were a country that the archetypal psychologist James Hillman, and if I come from anything, any template at all, it's a Jungian, post-Jungian template insofar as the poet Auden put it best: we are lived by powers we only pretend to understand. In other words, we go to sleep at night, we have dreams, and those dreams are telling us about our living life when we believe we're awake. You know, the term woke has been that the right has completely let it be defined. But I would look at being awake as far as making the unconscious conscious. So as you're forming your ideology, it's not coming from some reflex that comes from the past where you're immediately reacting to a situation and then using an exhausted template to describe it. To try to come to as close to the breathing moment as possible, insofar as that is applicable to what's going on. And as you were saying in your very eloquent, introduction, we are in novel times. We can use the template of fascism about what's happening. This merger of, let's say, Christian nationalism, a right-wing populist movement, and the corporate overclass. This is the perfect definition of being in fascist times. But this being the United States and coming about with all the elements that compose it, it's not going to look like where my mother escaped from Nazi Germany on a Kindertransport. It's going to have elements of that. It's going to have elements of the black shirts in Italy, but in a time where we don't have a Marxist critique, as 30% of the population of Berlin, 50%, I got that wrong. 50% of the population of Berlin identified themselves as socialists at the time of the rise of the Nazis. We as Americans don't have that. We are consumers. So we can't address this from the templates of the time. And unfortunately, we don't have the Red Army to come in and storm Berlin in 1945. So we're coming from a completely different world than the world of the last time fascism showed up.
Yeah, no, we have yet to really see, how I think we're kind of right at the beginning. And I mean, we can see that changes are about to take place very rapidly, but, we haven't really experienced them yet. Certain people have, but people in the U.S., like we have the luxury of just kind of continuing on our existence as if everything is normal. Not so much for the people in Europe, maybe definitely not the people in Ukraine and the people in Gaza. I don't know. I think did you write something about Steve Bannon talking about Trump being the president in 2028? And
yeah, that's what I woke up to this morning. Is that quote on the Counterpunch editor Jeffrey Sinclair's page, and I immediately associated it with something I'd have a Substack piece and should be published in other places in the coming days. About that, because as I mentioned before, the Gestapo showed up at my grandfather's door in Berlin and took him to concentration camp. My grandmother, who was a pretty brilliant and shrewd woman, was able to engineer an escape plan for him. He was able to escape, come to the United States, come to New York, and because he had been in the scrap metal business, that's how he got out. My grandmother played stupid woman. She said, "I'm too stupid to understand the papers," to the commandant. And she said, "I'll sign these over to you if you let him out to show me how to do it." And she got him with the underground and he escaped to the UK. And then when he came to New York, we were able to get to the United States because apparently with Ashkenazi Judaism, we're all fourth or fifth cousins, but we happen to be like second or third cousins to the Wahlberg the Wahlbergs, a very elite Jewish family,
Yes.
but they said you could come over if you don't darken our door.
Oh.
So my grandfather's peasant ass knocked on the door anyway and said, "Give me a loan to go to Atlanta so I can start a scrap metal business." So they gave him a loan, which he was able to repay. And the gist of the story, is I feel fascism down to my very DNA. I know that is what's happening. People will say, I'm being hyperbolic when I describe it, but this is fascism, and I see it. And I've connected to, for example, the last Substack piece I wrote time before last was about a friend of mine. When we were 14. We were art club nerds, and he was a pretty gifted artist, and he had kind of a William Blake-like sensibility, and we had affinities. I would write something, he would draw it, but since that time, he's become a Christian nationalist over time. And we had a friendship for about 2 years that he broke off when I became a little bit more adamant about what was actually going on. And I run into a lot of old friends here, and they are fascist adjacent here in Atlanta, here in Georgia. I can feel the emanations in there. Growing up in Birmingham too, which Jim Crow gave that element. I still remember my sister and I drinking out of the water fountains that were labeled colored to be able to see if they tasted different in any way. So this is, I remember standing in the dark room as pictures of the civil rights movement were showing up in my father's various pans that his photographic materials were in. So I have these memories very strongly. And Alabama run in the Jim Crow manner, where for example, if my father went and he asked for a raise, the boss would tell him there are 10 N-words I can find at any given moment on the street to replace you. So the same resentment of the working class was in Birmingham, which was a city that was, if you go to Birmingham, it doesn't look like a southern city. It looks like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because coal and steel barons bought it to exploit the ore that was in the Appalachian Mountains. So the ore would come in. The people who lived on that land, of course, not the Creek Indians, not the Choctaw Indians who had been driven out by ethnic cleansing, but the Scot-Irish people that the Tories did not allow in the good sections of town, were told, if you go ethnically cleanse this area, you can live there and spend your life breathing in coal dust, and that will be your reward. So Birmingham was built to exploit to exploit the ore coming in from Appalachia. And the people that ran it, we called them the big mules. They lived up on Red Mountain above the soot and the pollution. So it was, as the money flowed back to Pittsburgh and New York. So I grew up in a model, getting an idea of what can go wrong with the proletariat. That's the reason Martin Luther King chose Birmingham. He knew that Bull Connors, the chief of police, was going to show the world what the Jim Crow South actually looked like. Now we're getting that in the streets of Chicago.
I remember reading King's letter, from the Birmingham jail, which I found very powerful in community college, several decades ago.
Where he blamed the progressives for the problem. He said they were more dangerous than the Klan because they, I'm paraphrasing, but they put a barrier between the communities that were struggling. And, that was the thing, is King did try to include in his poor people campaign the white underclass being part of this. And I think that is pretty much how he signed his own death warrant, besides turning against the Vietnam War. It would be a really dangerous thing if the white proletariat was able to understand, the bait and switch that they're constantly, when George Wallace said, nobody's going to ever out N-word me again. And Nixon picked that up. Now we have an understanding of where the red states have, or Ronald Reagan saying, choosing Oxford, Mississippi, just miles from where 3 civil rights workers were buried in a dam, and using all those dog whistles. So, the able that we're able not to have a class-based assessment of this, as I'm sure everybody on your panel, I'm not saying anything novel to you guys about that, but I think that's extremely important. But it's been very depressing to return to Atlanta and speak again to my, because I grew up in a working class neighborhood, how we on the left just do not seem to be able to reach them. I had this very idealistic idea that I would start with my Christian fundamentalist friend a podcast. And because we got along for a 2-year period, until I think the pressures are getting him too much. There's too much of a bifurcation between what Christianity actually was, which was originally called the Way, which was, rabble out of the north of Israel that weren't in the ruling class of Jerusalem. You had this radical rabbi that had they weren't called for years. They weren't called Christians. They were just simply called the Way as a reaction to empire. Romans occupying, what I refer to as Palestine. I'm not fond of having the privilege of calling myself, a Zionist Jew. Years ago, even though it was anathema to my family who were Holocaust survivors, my grandmother actually ran money and guns to the Irgun. But, she did not, she actually made alliances between the Jewish community and King here in Atlanta. But I think her trauma, imagine putting your kids on a kinder transport and your husband going to jackbooted thugs taking your husband to concentration camps. She actually did believe that the only place Jews could live on earth was Israel. I don't think she quite understood that she had internalized that European colonialism was probably a good thing for everybody, and I don't think she ever evolved to the point she died of cancer in 1967. So I don't think she got to the point of seeing actually how the Zionist state played out. Because in her views, and we'll go into these kibbutzes, and it's going to be a socialist utopia, right? She thought Israel could show the world how socialism could work.
Yeah. So you said a lot. You triggered a bunch of thoughts, but yeah, let me get in. Ian, you look like you might be having.
Well, it depends. If you go 10 minutes, I'll forget what I was going to say. So it depends how long your Billy Bob rant's going to be. No. I don't mean you, but I don't want to forget what I was going to say. Maybe Billy Bob, share your reaction, and I'll take a turn. How's that?
No, that was my problem. Like I had some ideas and then they went away. Okay. So, so we're talking about ideology. You're mentioning that it's difficult to reach people. And I definitely concur with that. Like I'm having, a decade at least of really social media interaction with people. And it is a struggle to help them to, understand, concepts and that there's different points of view and to, systematically and dispassionately really just, objectively look and understand this is the position of, this ideology and this is the reality. And then other ideologies take these positions and, which one makes more sense. And it's like, there's just this reflexive, pro-capitalist, anti-communist, indoctrination that just kind of ruins people's ability to think rationally and logically for the most part. And sometimes like I would really like to have a discussion, a rational discussion with somebody who has a different point of view. But I found that, very few people are interested in engaging in that kind of discussion. Now, there's a lot of people that are on the left that agree with me that, are happy to have discussions. But from the other side, most people don't want to engage or learn. They're more interested in just, giving their own opinion and then telling you that, what you think is ridiculous. Anyway, that was my thought. Ian?
I think it's very interesting because what Phil was mentioning about the views of socialism in Germany and how the National Socialist Party, as they call themselves, branded that way and, of course, incorporated red so prominently in their marketing and branding for the exact reason they wanted communist-leaning working class people to attend their meetings, their political meetings, because, like every party, they told meetings, and they wanted, even if people didn't know who they were or what they were, they wanted people just to get into those meetings and hear what they had to say, and how a lot of the once they did come to power, they did a lot of things. Like they did Strength Through Joy, which was basically socialism, to bring culture and certain luxuries like public swimming pools to the masses. It was kind of it's actually very similar to what the Soviet Union was already doing, and it was just to counteract that, because the Germans did, because Germany did actually have I think it was 1923, is right after World War I. There was actually large scale communist uprising, an actual uprising in Germany. So there was a large German communist and socialist adjacent movement. Of course, once they came to power, those were the first people to be denounced and imprisoned, was the communists. And of course, the German Jews were generally associated with being communists, which was honestly kind of true most of the time. It's just like that's a particular demographic that's very associated with communist ideology. So they went after them too. I think what's interesting now, it's kind of a problem now because I think the problem is for the past 30 or 40 years, we've compared I think just about every American president since Clinton, maybe even earlier than that. But I think even Bush Sr. was compared to, and it's kind of message fatigue at this point. Even when there is truth, everybody is Hitler. Obama is Hitler. Bush is Hitler. Trump is Hitler. Who is not Hitler? But I think if we look at what are the differences and similarities, well, I think one, there's a generational difference because we definitely had a globalist period in USA. So it wasn't really even capitalism. It is, as Adam Smith knew, it's very much this global capital takeover that goes beyond borders. And what I find interesting about right-wing people I see now online, because I know I'm not in the USA for a few years, sometimes I feel like I'm out of touch, so I can only guess. I can't go out in the street and ask. But it seems like under 40 and especially under 35, it does seem like most right-wing young Republican type people are actually more socialist than there are capitalist. I think there's a very clear reason for that, because everybody associates, people under, I think Gen X was the last generation to really even remember when capitalism was even associated with prosperity. If you're under 40 now, all you know about capitalism is investors buying up a third of the real estate every month. It's just an oversaturation of workers, which is deliberate because they want to keep wages down. So you just look around and it's like, okay, there's poverty. I can't afford to buy anything. And, we don't have public health care, which was fine when we had the money to buy it ourselves, but now we don't. And the prices there's deliberate price gouging. There's monopolies, there's cartels, there's actual cartels running every industry. So people who aren't even old enough to remember the prosperity are just like, well, why do we even have it? I think it's unfortunate, but I would say a quarter to a third of Americans don't really even see Nazi Germany as bad. I don't know how many, if you polled people, I don't know how many people would admit it, but I think even just privately, they say, well, what was so bad about it? And unfortunately, I think, and that's also the result of, because, Phil mentioned being woke. Well, I think it might go earlier than this, but I know in French philosophy in the 1970s, that being woke, and that's pretty much the definitions he described it, and we've since then been co-opted. But if we look at like in the Matrix, we have this artificial reality. We have this artificial history that's been taught to us. We don't really know what was actually going on between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. We have this kind of fake pro-US, not even pro-US, like this very specific ideological reinvention of history that everybody's been taught. No one actually knows what happens. So even if someone rejects that, it's like, you know what, I think this is propaganda, I don't believe it. It's kind of out of the pot into the fire type situation. Because even if we have a free thinker, well, I don't believe this. Well, what's he going to, what's the truth? There's no like true version that's easily accessible to him.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's who do you listen to? You know, how do you figure out? You know, it's daunting for a lot of people, and then they just tune out because, you know, they don't feel like there's any chance that they can ever know with any certainty, you know.
But to respond to Pittsburgh dudes here who said Nick Fuentes is pushed on the right and this young people feeling economic pain and anti-Semitism is a socialism is full. Well, a big part of why it's growing, I do think it's true. I think anti-Semitism is 10, if not 100 times greater than it was 10 years ago. And well, I mean, the main root of anti-Semitism in the USA is support for Israel. That's 90%. That's where 90% of the sentiment comes from. We look at them, they blow up churches, they spit on Christians, they say all these things. Netanyahu boasts about how he controls the USA. He actually, I mean, it's not even me making it up. He actually gets up and says that. We have the USA under our thumb, that we can do whatever we want. And it's an actual genocide. And unfortunately, you know, it's very hard to separate the government from the people. You know, so when you have anti-Russian sentiment, you hate Russians. Anti-German sentiment, you hate Germans. You have anti-US sentiment, you hate Americans. Phil is going to say something.
Yeah, I just like to interject about like what you're saying, that there's a lot of happenstance in history. I mean, there's a reason that my grandfather, who was born a country boy, but he had a pretty brilliant mathematical mind, and he got a job in a bank in Frankfurt, and then was drafted, he was conscripted into the German army and was in Turkey in the war, and came back. The usury laws are the reasons that, you know, the Jews fell into the financial markets. And by happenstance of living in New York, the financial centers, the cliches of anti-Semitism, by there is so much Jewish investment because another, you know, outsider industry was Hollywood. So a lot of historical forces by Jews, you know, wanting a roof over their head, not being able to own property in Europe, becoming the Shakespearean Shylocks. A lot of cliches play into this. And then when you see Israel seeming to have the power over the United States that it does. I mean, you know, Israel stands there as a way for the United States to keep a foothold where all this oil wealth is. You know, the Jews of Europe, it was a good idea to get rid of us, to send us to Israel, perhaps. You know, it was never set up because the world felt guilty about the Holocaust.
Right.
So, very cynical reasons that Israel in the West is allowed to exist. And now it seems to be, that a lot of the cliches of anti-Semitism seem to resonate with people. But like I said, this is, to get it back to ideology, if I can go into I'm going to go into a way of a template using William James and his notion about how we filter down reality. I've heard an analogy used of a tick, that a tick, a tick doesn't even know it's sitting on a branch till certain of its senses are set off as far as chemical changes, a human being or an animal coming through, and the tick just drops onto the skin. And that's its reality. It can be sitting on a branch. If you tried to explain to a tick what the sky was, even what a branch was, there would be no template that it could understand it. And we as human beings are not all that different. We come into this dance of photons in front of us that we don't understand. We winnow it down so we can get through the day, so we're not tripping all the time. Our lives don't look like we're on DMT. We're not having we're not having visionary experiences that look more like dreams that people turn into religiosity. So we have a way of finding templates to describe the world as best we can. And the template of my dog or the template of my son, the templates we're using at different times in our life, we have to all find a way that they're applicable. And the only way to do that is I think, to avoid fascism. And I don't know how this would be done on a cultural basis, is to understand your own darkness. I can see the Nazi in me. I can feel myself bristle and want to control life around me when I feel like it's just being defined by dumb fuckery. And so, and this is what I said, this is the difficulty. And I have a certain naivety of trying to reach people on their own level. It was a disaster when I tried that with my Christian nationalist friend. And like I said, I'm feeling the hand of depression on me, guiding me about this, because the dark times we're in, perhaps, like you mentioned Nick Fuentes, there are plausible explanations of, like, the young people that grew up and all they've known is the exploitation of capitalism, but there's no way to get Marx, Engels into their hands so they can understand the inherent way that fascism comes about out of capitalism. So fascism becomes very appealing, not in the form of these ecstatic torch processions going through the streets of Germany. And I wanted to add too that there was a socialist republic of Bavaria before the Free Corps, disillusioned soldiers, very much like we have now, coming back from the First World War, killed, I think it was 50,000 socialists and leftists on the streets of Munich, to put a stop to that 30-day experiment in communism in the most conservative area of Germany after the war, Bavaria. So yeah, I find these times very disconcerting, and I think, like all of us, we're looking for a way to engage the working class. And Nick Fuentes, from his mother's basement, seems to be able to do it, but we're failing.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised. Like, I don't know exactly. I think there's forces and people behind Nick Fuentes that are promoting him, right? Like, I don't think any of these big names that everybody is familiar with are just people like us who just happen to get really popular. I don't think it works like that.
Charlie Kirk was, he was a grifter that was able to connect to essentially the capitalist and Zionist ruling class. Yeah.
And so you get donors, you get rich benefactors, and then you get promoted by the the owners of these media platforms, and then your stuff is just put everywhere, and then all of a sudden you're popular and people are listening to what you have to say. But it doesn't happen organically; it's a top-down kind of thing.
Well, I think when we're talking about Nazi Germany, it's just like the Nazis and all this. I think we're kind of in a feedback loop here, right? Because it's a law of thermodynamics. Because I think it's true. You see, it's a reactionary movement, but if you don't want a reaction, I think the first step is to stop pushing. Because I think we have had several, and Billy Bob knows who I'm talking about. We've had certain leftists on this show who just the idea. I mean, they get so offended at the idea that anybody would like Trump, and that some white working class person. You know who I'm talking about. You see Unati. You know who I mean, right? They get, it's like, well.
Any number of people. Any
number of people, right. I think there needs to be rather than complain about it, I think there needs to be a compromise, because I think it's getting hard to argue at this point. There isn't pushing too much. There wasn't too much pushing the opposites.
I mean, I would, jump in and say there's a huge contrast with traditional fascism, because the U.S. barely has a left. I mean, you might complain about liberals, but there's no significant left here.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But owning the libtards, this whole idea that the conservatives I talk to, they conflate, of course, I try to explain to them that liberalism, is the buffer zone between the working class and the leftist ideology, but they can float to left socialism. It's all the same to them. And that's what I mean. This is like I'm talking about the hallucination we live in, that when you're talking to somebody that's a rightist, my wife grew up, she was born in a hospital, but the house she came back to was essentially a tenant farmer shack. that her family, when they had been in the turpentine business and had gotten wiped out, they had lived, and she essentially, they were welders, other people at that point, before they came up in the world and built their Jim Walter house. But I don't know a liberal that would know what even that is, So her idea of how she looks at the world, she is one of those people that does get offended by MAGA because I don't know. She said ever since she was, and she's a bastard out of Carolina too. She, her mother got pregnant on prom night of 1968, and the upper class boy that got her mother pregnant, her family had nothing to do with it, but she was ostracized from her church because of that status. But she said ever since she was a child, she knew she didn't belong there, so she found a way to get to art school in Atlanta. But she does get, it brings back the pain of her childhood, being thrown out of the church, being ostracized by the community. And so when people start I have an understanding of why people do bristle at that. I'm a little bit different. I try to find the affinities with people, but I'm finding it very rough to face this fascist juggernaut we're in, because it is a fascist idea that comes out of the idea that you can, the fascists have a very appealing notion. We can control the world. We can return the world to a nostalgic past that never was. These strong judges, stormtroopers will protect you, and these glumping pigtail children are the future. That's very appealing for people that have no future. So people in MAGA, when Trump says he can restore it, when, like my white Christian friend, he went down to Georgia State University and it terrified him because of the so-called multiculturalism. And what was behind that is he's an old man and he knew the world was not going his way anymore. And he had also quit his job because he had retired early. He'd worked he'd worked in the PR department of Porsche, a German company, because he grew up in Germany when he was a child. His father was in military intelligence. But he had to sign a document saying he would accept trans people, gay people, and of course his religion forbid this. And this was this came out of the Biden administration because Porsche got a tax break. They didn't suddenly grow woke, but if they had people sign this document, which was a kind of capitalist McCarthyism, and I wouldn't say it was leftist, the identity politics that came out of it. But, I said, yeah, I fully support you not signing that document. If they said the same thing about me being a socialist, I would hope you support me in the same way. I don't think he would, but so he lost, he retired early because of that. And so when he went down to Georgia State to take some classes in journalism, he was hearing this at the time before the backlash, this fashionable woke ideology that came out of this notion of multiculturalism that comes out of a television commercial, which actually supports Rachel Maddow's going to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is now woke, which Hegseth is now having a reaction against. So once again, I think we're having arguments, both sides, left and right. And I don't mean the leftists here, people, they're steeped in a Marxist ideology. I mean, the people that came from a multicultural perspective arguing with old white men. I think that's the divisiveness that we're talking about, where what gets lost is in cognitive dissonance.
We talk about the culture war versus the class war. And, I really think that there's an overt top-down effort to inflame and rile up the culture war because that's how they keep us divided and keep us from uniting in the class war and, making improvements. And so I kind of just see the liberals and conservatives as both ideologies that are manipulated, by the ownership class to stay at each other's throats and then to perpetuate this two-party system, which is really just one party, because the billionaires are happy. Whoever's in power, Democrat, Republican, they don't care. But so Ian was talking about how a lot of people are kind of far more preferential to the Democrats and the leftists on the cultural milieu, but they really have this seething hatred for the conservatives. And I kind of reject that whole thing. And I see that these people sometimes have a tendency to over demonize, people who are conservatives, right? Who are religious. They over demonize them. And they, just because, you might wear a red hat, that means you're a Nazi. Because you're a Christian, that means you're a racist. And, all kinds of things. And in my opinion, it's like they're both equally confused. They both don't get it. They're both caught up in this cultural war. And we need to outreach to both of them. We need to explain to both the conservatives and the liberals that, hey, there's an actual reality that exists beneath a material reality that exists beneath your culture war. And, we're never going to have agreement on abortion. It's like, Christians are always going to think that it's wrong, and liberals are always going to think that, it needs to be legal. And again, I would agree that we need to keep it legal, but we can't expect, that question is going to be solved before we move on to the class struggle. And we just need to agree to have differences and unite, in the class struggle is my advocacy, is what I try and advocate for. But it's a very complex thing when we talk about, because there's not a neat separation between culture and class, honestly, and so it does get more complicated. Go ahead, Phil. Or Ian. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say. Well, the issue here is, which you touched on, but I think the issue is that a lot of these leftists have conflated, or not, maybe not even conflated, are just in bed with multiculturalism. And the thing is that, we're saying, okay, culture war and class war are two separate things. Well, okay, if you want to talk to, not every leftist, but the large majority of leftists in the USA have multiculturalism as a central tenet. And if you're against multiculturalism, you're a fascist. And that's fine to do, but in any country, I moved to Russia. If you told Russians, well, you have to be multicultural now, you don't have a choice. Well, a lot of them would reject it too, and I would say Russians.
What does it mean to reject multiculturalism? What is rejecting multiculturalism in action? Are you going to deport everybody who's not white?
Well, so I'll give you a good example. So this morning on Facebook, I saw this viral post. This guy. There's a screenshot from Twitter. This guy said, he's a youngish guy, I think probably 20s or 30s. He said he went to 4 job interviews this week, and all 4 of them were Indian managers, which is true. If you look at a lot of industries, particularly in California and some of the East Coast states, those industries are almost entirely non-white. They're Indian. The H-1B visa program. So I think not everybody, but a lot of people who go through that are going to come out the other end saying, well, you know what? Maybe nationalism isn't a bad thing. Why do we? Because it's humiliating. Let's be honest. It's humiliating to be, grow up in a country and then have to find that your future is controlled by foreigners who don't even like you. They're going to hire because I'll be honest, these guys are not going to hire you. They walk in, you're some freaking white Joe Blow from West Virginia or wherever. They're not going to hire you. They just won't. So my question for, people want everyone to get on board with the class war. What can you say to people who've experienced that?
Well, I think you have to explain to them that this is capitalism, business as usual, and human nature. I was going to ask everybody a question of what you would do about this, and you seem to have beat me to it. That, when I was visiting South Carolina, speaking of the class war, my wife's half brother, who actually, it's one of those funny Southern stories where his grandmother had gotten pregnant from a field hand. And they said Buddy, his father, was a Native American. He just had a lot of Cherokee blood. And so you look at Norman, that's the fellow's name. He looks a little like Malcolm X, but he can pass as white. But the entire conversation I had with him, where even though his father, Buddy, the Native American, had a business where he drains the swamps and cuts down the timber, So they're not going to be exactly enlightened as far as the ecosystem goes in that form of leftism. His entire conversation with me was about, with various memes about Hollywood wokeness, about Disney was the problem. And I tried to explain to him that these are affluent people that could go to film school. This was not any big leftist agenda, but his daughter wanted to manipulate him. She wanted to go back to the city and go back to the little town there and not the city, but she didn't like the particular recreational area they were. She was bored, and she used the excuse to manipulate Daddy that lesbians were coming on to her. And so multiculturalism worked. I would go, how would you people speak to Norman? Because he agreed with me with every socialist tenet I made, as you were pointing out about younger people understand this, even though he had grown quite privileged from it. He still was been able to manipulate in classical ways that it was the outsider other that was the reason for his discontent. And this is always going to be powerful. That we look upon, the outsider other, whether it's the meme you were talking about of somebody that grew up in Indian culture and came here, I guess, because of the class system in India, because of the caste that's there, that Indians take so many take so readily to capitalism. And they're able to adapt to this culture and thrive, as my Jewish grandfather was able to come here. And before he died of a heart attack in 1957, coming here in 1940, he was able to build up a scrap metal business, because he was able to take to that because of his Jewish identity, but got lots of anti-Semitism about who is this wealthy Jew. Now I didn't get that money. He got screwed out of his business partners, screwed him out of any money that might come from it. So, there was an aspect of this, of how these cultural cliches play in, and this template that we can call, this template of how we see each other and misapprehend each other. How do I reach Norman's humanity? In those situations, because it's very difficult, because essentially he's coming at me from a dream. He's coming at me from this series of templates that he believes are truthful, that get him through the day. And his daughter is actually able to manipulate him because she can understand and play upon Daddy's prejudices. How do you reach somebody like that?
No, I mean, Ian brought up an interesting point. And I mean, I think that, like you said, Phil, I mean, you just have to explain that the reality that exists here, there's reasons for it. And I mean, there's reasons that, the owners of the industries in Silicon Valley want to bring over, these Indian people who are willing to work for a lot less than the domestic workers would. And they just, they find them much more hardworking and much more pliable. And also it does, it also further benefits the ruling elite's agenda, because it does divide society into all these little identity groups, So you've got, people from all cultures, all walks of life, and it's easier for them to keep us split and fractionalized and not, being united. It's easy to keep us from being united with all these diverse groups in the country. So, I mean, that's the reality that we have to overcome as a class. We have to figure out how to overcome these cultural differences and unite. And, there's no other option, but I don't think we can really, hate on the Indian man who happens to be, choosing our, whether we're going to get hired or not.
Yeah, well, here's a question. Okay. I do have a question. So let's say on that same topic, let's say right now in 2025, let's fast forward 2028. Let's say the next presidential election, we have a clone of Bernie Sanders in 2012, right? Before he before he went over to Hillary Clinton and repeated, you have a guy who's like, okay, I want universal health care. I want, family payments, I want all of these great leftist things, but we're also going to lock down the border. Right. Is that a candidate you would endorse? That's an open question for everybody here.
would I, in other words, we get into the classic trope of the lesser of two evils, right? Under a capitalist system. See, my own opinion is, okay, well, let's go back to Roosevelt. Would I have voted for Roosevelt, who, was a blue blood, but understood fascism was coming or socialism was coming, and he put a number of the minimum of progressive measures in place to stop that from happening, zero socialist ones. And would I have voted for Roosevelt rather than risk an American Bund? So it's not an easy question. We were able to force, we were able to forestall American fascism for a number of years. But see, I think everybody here understands that fascism is going to keep coming about because of the very structure of capitalism, where both political parties are going to be owned by the ruling class. And so Chomsky's famous critique that we're going to only be able to argue within certain narrow boundaries. Everybody on this panel understands it. I've tried to explain that to my wife's family, who, you go to their gatherings and every other word is the N word, even though the black people down the road are exactly the same plight as they are. And I've sat down and I can get them to agree to every socialist tenet I bring up, but somehow having the N word there explains their life better. That somehow the government is giving black people an advantage, which of course isn't even happening. And they have, like the Indian man you were describing, it seems to be, I'm swimming against the stream of what keeps them going. Even though they understand climate change, because a lot of them work as roofers, a lot of them work outdoors, and their health is ruined by that. They know the climate's changed. And their bodies are falling apart between American bad food, consumerism again, corporatism again. That's the reason the food they eat. You can understand this, but somehow they are unreachable. If I can go into a slight digression about something Pete Seeger said to me, and me and a group of people, it wasn't a solitary conversation. He said he was touring with Woody Guthrie, and they were way back in Arkansas. And there was a little miners' strike going on, and they went to play the Union Hall, and they went in there, and it was full of women and children because people couldn't afford babysitters, of course. And into their set, in walked the company thugs. They're long coats, they have pipes and other things up below them. And Pete looks at Woody, and Woody says, just play like you've never done before, and just go down and reach it sincerely. So they played, and they ended their set. And afterwards, one of the company thugs comes over and he says, "We came to break up this meeting, but you're not who we told you were." And Woody wrote Union Maid that night. So it's like, okay, how Woody Guthrie reached people? On his guitar it says, "This machine kills fascists." In the 60s, I would go to the Piedmont Park here in Atlanta and see the Allman Brothers play. And to get there, I'd have to go through, at the time now it's totally gentrified, and it's a neighborhood, but at the time it was a working class neighborhood. And people would be out working on their GTOs with their sleeves rolled up and Marlboro Red in a box and Royal Crown slicked hair back. And they chased me into the park and the other long hairs. And then they'd go there, but they'd see something was going on. The Allman Brothers would be playing. There'd be all these pretty hippie women. And the women didn't pay any attention to them whatsoever. But you would see the guys coming back, and then the Royal Crown would be out of their hair, and their hair would be hanging lank, and they'd be laying back on the grass going, "Dwayne's guitar is shooting blue sparks into my brain," because they'd be doing a little Orange Sunshine. And then so culturally what happened, until the economy, till the ruling put clamps on, until Reagan and cocaine came into it, you had these kind of working class hippies, which Willie Nelson represented when he went to Austin. So the cultural force has to be in there too, as far as art, as far as music, And us ideological guys, even though that, I play a little music and was on musical tours for a while, I found that's a much easier way to reach people. Is if I'm was busking out on the street with my ukulele, I could reach more people by satire, leftist political songs than I ever can on Facebook or writing my articles.
Well, I think we're conflating. Well, I mean, that is an answer, but I think we're conflating racism with borders. So, and this is here's some statistics I looked up recently. So, the population of Russia, just Russia, not the other Soviet states, in 1965 was 120 million. Right now, Russia is 150 billion. It's also, it got a little bit bigger, right? So not counting Crimea and Donbass, if it was just the territory that it had in 1965, it'd be around 145 million. Now, the USA, does anyone here know what the population of the USA was in 1965?
Oh, no, I know what it is now. I don't know what it was.
It was about 150 million.
It's 106, very close. Yes, it was 180 million in 1965. Now it's 360 million.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, can we not agree that completely changes the economic makeup of the country when you double the population? Because remember how boomers would say, well, back in my day, I would just walk into a shop and want to see the manager, and he'd give me a job on the spot. Well, that's not going to happen now. You're going to have 100. If you have a job now, you're going to have 100 people, literally 100 people apply for it.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think as a personal point of frustration for me, who would like to see, economic leftism in the USA, that no one can let go of the issue that pisses the majority of working class people off is the immigration. If you could just say, if you had a left-wing politician that said, you know what, I want a leftist welfare state, but I understand you cannot have an infinite number of people drawing those benefits, so I'm going to close the border. I mean, tons of people would get behind it. Even hardcore right-wing Republicans, especially young ones, would get behind that guy. But no one wants to do that because it's such a core leftist, for whatever reasons I don't fully understand. It's just this core belief.
Maybe I can help.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My great-grandmother had to go through the Siberian Express to go to Japan to get out of Germany. She went to Japan. This was, of course, right before the war started in the Pacific. And then she came across, they wouldn't allow her to get off the boat as a Jew in San Francisco. They wouldn't let her at Port of Los Angeles, San Diego the same way. She had to finally get off the boat in Argentina and work her way up to New Orleans before she could reunite with the family. And so there's me with my mother, coming to the States as a child, and so many people returning to the death camps. There are reasons people come over the border, because a border is an artificial construct. These people are actually more American than as European that are coming over the border from the South, that are heading El Norte. So there is an aspect to me that we're human, we have a tendency. I don't think the left should play into these prejudices of the others because, it leads to Treblinka. And, the Soviet Union, which, you're in the former Soviet Union now. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the history of this. But was the Soviet Union more multicultural? I mean, Stalin was a Georgian. And when you had Azerbaijan and you had all these other regions before its collapse, how did the average person feel about the other? I'm asking this as a question.
Well, no, that's a fair question. It was very multicultural. Stalin was less multicultural than Lenin. And a lot of it was, regardless of what he personally felt, was the necessity of stirring up patriotism for the war.
And Brezhnev was Georgian too, wasn't he?
Brezhnev was, I want to say Ukrainian.
Was he Ukrainian?
I think he was Ukrainian. Khrushchev was definitely Ukrainian. I think Brezhnev was too, if memory serves me correct. But so like the Communist International was originally the anthem of the Soviet Union. They actually replaced it in it was either at 1941 or 1942. I don't quite remember the year, but it was during the war. They introduced the Soviet anthem that they used up until 1991, and actually the musical score to it is still the same in the Russian anthem, and it's the Great Rus. The Great Russia is so they did shift to a more patriotic or even slightly jingoistic tone for the necessity of the war that was just deemed to mobilize people better. But yes, it was a multicultural entity, and Russia now is a federation. So it's so to an extent it's multicultural. So you have the individual regions, the individual states can to an extent set up their own rules and their own values, because there are several in North Caucasus, there are several Muslim majority or about 50-50 split regions. But it wasn't from immigration. It was always, they were just always kind of Russian, because since Ivan the Great annexed them back in the 17th century.
Let me jump in.
Go ahead.
About immigration. I was just looking up some statistics. From 1910 to 1960, the population went from 90 to 189 million. So another doubling right there. And that's when we became a superpower.
Yes.
So I mean, it's about the crisis.
Well, there was true. The birth rates were a lot higher.
Imperialism.
We industrialized. The USA industrialized in that period. But I think I was getting at that.
Massive immigration too.
Well, yes. But that was also quite controversial at the time. I remember, in fact, reading about the Chinese immigration for the railroads. And the reason why is because the railroad jobs were literally so bad. Even the Irish and the black freedmen didn't want those jobs because they were so terrible. So what does the railroad companies do? Which, by the way, I'll add, those railroad companies were not free market. As the libertarians say, the free market. Well, no, they were receiving huge government subsidies to build the railroads. But as
with the migrants and everything in the West. I mean, that's libertarian fantasies or the ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Received huge subsidies. And of course, eminent domain for building over people, because it wasn't empty. Right. They built over people's property. They were quite, let's say, harsh about getting people to sell and vacate their property to build the railroad. Despite all that, they still did not want to pay people, so they imported someone who was desperate enough to do it. And naturally, the workers who were already here were not happy about that. There was they were the people who are come to replace striking workers are referred to as scabs. There were incidents where, there was one particularly bad incident when there was a train carrying Chinese workers, and the striking workers actually set it on fire with everybody still on the train. So yes, I think the main problem with mass immigrations, it's never done with the consent of the population. Because you're right, Greg. There have been several large scale waves of immigration to the USA, and none of them were consensual. So if we're going to talk about,
they were written in Congress.
Well, they were written in Congress, right? But the majority of the population was never on board with it. So so the USA is, and we have this joke.
Well, the U.S. isn't a democracy, period, ever, right?
It's supposed.
That's the closest we come as our Congress.
But it seems to me then somehow, because yes, this happened with the waves of Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, that somehow that as it's been pointed out a number of times during this dialogue, that the ruling class behind this need, like as I pointed out in Birmingham, cheap labor was behind Jim Crow. In Atlanta, if a black man walked the streets before Hitler shamed Roosevelt about this is in Atlanta. There was a company called the Atlanta Brickworks, and they were connected with the Atlanta Police Department. And a black man had to have on his person a letter from his white boss. Otherwise, they went to jail and were put on work crews building the streets and structures of Atlanta. And Hitler pointed it out, and Hitler got in touch with, the Georgia economic and governmental elite, and then it stopped. And so this is what is behind this is human beings are always going to find a way
black code
to economically exploit the other. And, so somehow, and I like this one, I mean, this is where I'm feeling a little bit of despair. I talk about this all the time with my working class friends, with my wife's family, and there seems to be radical obtuseness involved about how do you change that. You have to change the very structure of somebody's psyche before they're willing. It's like you could use the analogy of a 12-step program, that this is the reason in the 12-step they say you need a higher power. In other words, what that simply means is that there's nothing really godlike involved other than you have to stop believing your own bullshit somehow. And that higher power comes about as a force from the unconscious. It comes about in a point where the psyche is so devastated, like Year One in Germany. I don't know if you guys have seen that Rossellini film, which is an answer to the German propaganda films about the Hitler Youth, about what actually happens to a young man after in Year One Berlin, where they would turn these martyred boys into people to join the Hitler Youth. But the devastation that comes about in the wake of, let's say, an addiction, though the Calvinist aspects of the Christian Calvinist aspects of the 12-step program turn it towards a higher power. The higher power can also be a transformative ideology, to get back to that, about how, these working class people came over, Emma Goldman throwing hard bagels at people she disagreed with in debates in the Second Avenue deli. Ironically enough, I lived in Second Avenue for my 20 years in New York, and the Second Avenue deli, I watched it transform into a Citibank, if you want to watch neoliberalism. So there is a way that people, I think, can be reached by a type of what, I'm going to go for it once again to a word from religiosity. A rebirth comes about, like I was talking about, happened in Piedmont Park, or when I ran away from home and I went to the Great Speckled Bird, the underground newspaper here, and I hear leftism for the first real time, not the liberalism of my family. And so that worked as an awakening that actually felt spiritual to me. And it was a whole new template of looking at the world that infused me with energy. And I think that, and as I started moving on and becoming a more accomplished poet, when I was mentioning the poet Auden before, we're lived by powers we only pretend to understand. My better poems and even political pieces are written by a force inside that is really ineffable to describe. And I think, and I don't disclude all political ideology, that can happen, but it can also happen in the form of fascism. You can have these various static Nuremberg rallies, and this is what the right is so much better at this time, because we have not found a way to challenge the templates of capitalism to ordinary people, and that's what I'm searching for.
So Ian, makes the point that it's just a real appealing to a lot of people looking around and thinking, what's the problem here? And instead of, maybe seeing a complex reality clearly, where you have a class divide and you have a ruling class that is interested in, doing all these policies that aren't in the interest of the working class. Or you just see, these immigrants and they're now deciding if I get a job or not, the Indian guy in Silicon Valley that Ian was mentioning. And so one of these things is just a lot more compelling, is what Ian is making the case. And then, the question is, what can we do to deal with that reality that one narrative is, to many people just way more compelling than a complex reality, that that we on the left understand and try and engage with. But yeah, no, it's a
I mean, the last thing that seemed to penetrate widely, and I still hear echoes of this talking to people, is Occupy. And I mean, I'll talk to people who are angry about the Trump kind of issues, immigration, crime, and the 1%.
Yeah, I mean, I covered Walsh for leftist publications, Counterpunch, Common Dreams. I wrote quite a bit about it. I spent a lot of time there, and there was an affinity. But I also witnessed 5,000 militarized police from the Tri-City area descend on Lower Manhattan, and destroy everybody's property that was there. And then this is what doesn't surprise me. Fascism has already happened. We've already internalized this. And the thing that I was, to elaborate what I was talking about before about living on Second Avenue, a little down Third Avenue, another Marx family was born, the Marx brothers. And in movie theaters all the way to the time of the Great Depression, they would see these fobs of the ruling class made fun of. And you can't underestimate how powerful that is. And that somehow, and so, we have liberal Hollywood now, we have woke Hollywood now. That the message doesn't seem to be getting through. But as we're coming upon an economic collapse, it'll probably look a little bit like Weimar Germany. As you were talking about the work situation. I think it's 1/4 of the young people that graduated from college recently. They are chronically unemployed now. As AI replaces more jobs, this is what capitalism can do. They're going to need less immigrants or less people from India, because what those people are doing, AI is going to do. Now we have the opening to do what Emma Goldman, what other leftists did. Actors, entertainers, writers, intellectual, then we're going to give them the point. But, and I include myself in this, we just have to get the fuck over ourselves. I think they're just, we might know a few things, but at the same time, this is what I try to do. And like I said, I've been failing miserably. My Christian friend stopped talking to me when I was talking to him, and he brought up Thomas Stowell. And I said he was a house Negro, and he gets well rewarded for what he does, though nobody reads it. And so it's like, this is what, and he could not wrap his hand around it. And he came from a perspective where that he just could not handle that idea that Charlie Kirk, who he thought was just helping the young people come to Christianity, he could not wrap his head around the fact that he is involved with the present day Pharisees. And so you get to a point where people's entire world is involved with something that gets them through the day. And unfortunately, that's where fascism has a lot of power, or the Bolshevik Revolution, or any ways where people are so desperate for something that is going to alleviate the depression and put them in the mania of a spirit. And I'm using the word spirit from the Jungian context of what compels us into the world. And what compels us into the world can be ideology, it can be religion, it can be art, it can be a whole lot of things. But really now on the left, we're kind of in a place where we're to put it poetically, as T.S. Eliot did after the verities of the First World War fell apart, we're in a wasteland. And out of that wasteland, where, to put it again, using mythopoetic tropes, what would be the grail for the left? And I'm asking this as a question for everybody.
There's the challenges that we're up against are immense. I mean, all the platforms of mass communication are owned and operated, in service of the billionaires. But one thing that has been the biggest challenge, I think, is the complacency. And like most people feel that they're doing okay, that they're getting by. So the crumbs, the scraps of imperialism are benefiting, the domestic population and not making them, really care to clue in beyond whatever narrative that they have, been indoctrinated by. And so I think if, there is some economic, problems, that can change this dynamic, and it can, cause people to maybe really look honestly, with some more intent than they've had in the past to try and figure out what's going on. And so, a change in the material conditions obviously can create an opening. But yeah, no,
Well, don't we have though?
Go ahead.
I mean, don't we have a crisis like that right now? That's why we have Trump.
It's quite possible that we will. I mean,
why do
I don't
people
think we've seen anything
turn
major
against-
yet. Go ahead.
I mean, what's the reason for the turn against immigrants? If not for at least perception of economic squeeze, right?
Yeah, but again, I don't know if that's really enough. Like, it's not enough. I mean, this country's functioning, right? I mean, once this country ceases to function, I think that's when people will be really serious about wondering what's going on.
Well, I mean,
there's degrees. There's just degrees of economic collapse, and I don't think we're anywhere close to the kind of degree that's necessary for people to say, wait a minute, what the fuck,
Well, I was in Portugal when Salazar was still there. First time I went to Portugal was in the 70s, and people, it was fascism, but people still ate in cafes. They still went about their normal life. There, and I think that's a great misunderstanding that that maybe comes out of Orwell, or how the Soviet Union was characterized in the United States as this gray place where everybody dresses in uniformity, and so the idea that people go around in a totalitarian system and they look and act a particular way when there's not, there was music in the cafes, there were poets reading, the secret police weren't carrying people off. And I think in the United States, I think we've internalized by way of hyper-capitalism, by having no alternative for years. You mentioned earlier, like, I've witnessed in my life that, that Reaganism was doubled down by, it was on stilts and steroids under Clinton. That Reagan's and the Reaganites' dreams Clinton put through there with the banking legislation and everything else. Then Obama continued, what went on with the Bush Cheneys. So it was like we've internalized for so long, and I think capitalism is always, there's a component that can rise as fascism. That we are inside, all of us, even though we don't know it, have that element. Because what is fascism besides giving us an ideology to explain the world and the way that we feel secure, that daddy's going to take care of it? There's an old Peanuts cartoon of, you didn't think about it. Like, I remember being in the back of my, in the back of my parents' car, sleeping as we drove through Alabama somewhere, no seatbelts on. We'd fall asleep, and there's this feeling of security when your parents pick you up and they put you in your bed at night and you wake up. That's fascism. That's daddy who's going to take care of everything. I don't know if you saw Tucker Carlson's speech. He did it here in Atlanta, and it was all about how when Trump's elected, daddy's coming home. And the teenage girl who's, wearing a tube top it's going to be, her ways are going to be changed. And the infant that's smearing shit on the wall, and the whole house is going to be cleaned up when daddy comes home. Well, this is what the fatherland does. This is what the Fuhrer does. This is the idea that I can't take the ox anymore. Ox being a word that goes back to the ancient Greek for the goddess of necessity. Her name was Ankati. Her name comes out of a chain you put around slaves and livestock. And she's the root word of anxiety and ox. And so when we're feeling this prevailing cultural hopelessness around anxiety, somebody that can relieve that anxiety is going to be appealing to us.
Well, I need to interject. So, so every human being has a fatherland. The Russians call it, Rodina, or you can translate it as motherland, however you want to translate that word. It's actually a parent, literally what it means. But I think every human, I know this is class struggle, but every human has this idea that, there is a nation, there is a fatherland, and there is a government that is in power either through an election or a monarchy or however that government came into power that is supposed to do certain things. And I guess my point of frustration, so I see guys like Trump. I've got many complaints about Trump, but I see Trump as this guy who is coming up there and say, yes, there's all these problems, and I'm the guy who's going to fix it. And then
it never fails when Ian has something to say, his mic cuts out. Hopefully he'll be right back. I can respond, Phil.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ian.
Oh, I got cut out. And my joke is that it's the deep state. Whenever my internet cuts out, it's the deep state that's censoring me. But so there's these guys, there's all these problems, and I'm going to fix it. And my point of contention is that, the left should also be saying some of these things. I'm not saying copy Trump's position, but they should be saying, yes, there's crime, there's poverty. We're going to fix these things, but there is, a fatherland, and there is, a nation, there is, a government. And if it's not supposed to fix crime, if it's not supposed to fix poverty, what exactly is it supposed to do? I get the communist position to reject nationalism and, the communist proletariat, the international proletariat. I get that. But if you're not, go ahead.
You can see the disaster of the rise of the nation states in Europe. I mentioned T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, when the European aristocracy and capitalist class completely destroyed themselves, leading itself to another war, of course, where the Nazis had a hyper-nationalist mentality. So I understand the rise of internationalism insofar as the disasters of the 20th century. If you look at a map of Europe, and I've seen this morphing map of the various rises and changes of the nation state, this is essentially bloodletting. This is essentially Europe drenching itself in blood over a nationalist idea. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not going for the paranoia of the one world government as a solution. I just happen to think that we have to reach people on the level. And this, what you were saying about Trump. Yeah, Trump is a salesman, and salesmen know how to have a grift to be able to sell hope. And that's essentially when you're going and you have a really talented salesman, whether it be Oprah from the liberal class or whether it be Trump, you have a person that's telling you that something that is in no way can change your life and transform it and bring hope is going to do that, whether it be a new outfit or the gift that Oprah puts under her box or Trump's, idea of MAGA. You have, and this is the reason you have all these internet grifters. There's obviously an archetype involved in this. It's the archetype of, I mentioned Greek before. This is the trickster god of Hermes. This is in the polis of ancient Greece. If a person was in the agora, there would be, and this is, I think a lot of times leftists don't look in this. There's been a shift since the Bronze Age of how we view the world on a neurological basis. When a Greek was actually in the agora, they actually saw, like people in the time of Jesus's time, they saw Athena. If they looked out into the Mediterranean, they saw Poseidon. And the Greeks told this story as if there was a vote of who was going to be the patron of Athens, whether it was going to be Athena or whether it was going to be Poseidon. And Poseidon won, lost by one vote. And they put the god of chaos out in the ocean. So all this resentment that we see in the Trumpian working class is hitting the shore of Athens. But up in the agora, you have Hermes, who was the marketplace where the grifters, when you went to that place in the Agora, they put it on outside of it, and when you walked up to it, there were giant statues of penises. Later, the Christian imagination cut them down and essentially admit this was a warning. Be careful here. This is the financial class. They're dickheads. Be careful with your money. And so they had a way of poetically looking at the world. And this is how democracy was defined. You had the Trojan War. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter to get a win to go to this disastrous Trojan War. His son Orestes gained that legacy by essentially, being involved in this family bloodletting that went on. As we can see, this divided country now, the Furies chased him to the Oracle of Apollo, and Apollo said, "Go to Athens, go to the city, put yourself on trial." And on the trial there, the Furies were the prosecuting attorney that wanted his death. Athena was his defense attorney, and Athena, being the polis, being city, being civilization, she represented that, and a compromise was made. The compromise was this: the Furies transform their anger to those who stand against the democratic process and those who bear false witness. And this was the idea of, like you can see it in the ideal of the courtroom, prosecuting attorney, defense attorney, and the chorus effect of the jury. And we're supposed to be the chorus of democracy. That's supposed to be us. And that's
I don't know.
Failed at. And my point being, see how stories are the things that lead us, and we on the left need a better story. They're just not compelling to us anymore.
Well, that is definitely one of many, many challenges faced by people on the left. There's our own limitations in communication. There's the people that we're trying to communicate to, their own limitations in being able to understand and comprehend, and then there's this massive echo chamber that we're up against, saying all kinds of nonsense 24/7. And I think hopefully we will not have any kind of tremendous economic collapse in order to, get people's attention and get people to really pay attention. Hopefully that's not necessary. Ian, you're sighing and struggling.
I'm sorry. I'm struggling. I'm trying. I don't understand. I mean, because I did pose a question, and I just don't understand the.
What was your question? Because I did forget about your question too.
Okay, so we were talking about nationalism, and I mean, it was a great lecture on Greek city-states and the how people mystified the world, the natural world, before the invention of science.
They sounded like they had better stories than we do.
Yes, or great drugs. I just don't feel like maybe that didn't answer.
What was the question, Ian?
Okay, let me rephrase. Okay, so I'll just repeat it. succinctly. The idea of nationalism is that you have a fatherland, you have a government, and this fatherland and government is responsible for doing certain things, like protecting you, ending poverty, and crime, and all that. There's a list of basic things that people expect them to do. So right now, the U.S. government is not doing those things, and you have certain right-wing guys, not necessarily even Trump himself, but you have certain right-wing guys, certain mouthpieces, who are saying, well, the government should be doing those things. And so what's the response to that?
Yeah, well, the paradigm that I always engage with, that I think is the most, rational and reality-based, is, I explain there's a class struggle and there's a class divide. Every nation that has a capitalist system is divided between the ownership class and the working class. And so the question is, who is going to be the governing your nation? Is it going to be representatives of the billionaires, the ownership class, or is it going to be representatives of the working class? And so right now, we have a lot of problems in this country, and a lot of those problems are caused by pursuing the interests of the billionaire class to the detriment of all the rest of us. And so you deal with that primary foundational issue, and you're going to have improvement. And so that is my constant advocacy on social media, is to highlight this reality of class struggle, oppositional class interests, and explain how a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today are a result of a government just pursuing only caring about the interests of the wealthy elites. Phil?
Well, you're right about that. Now let's go back to Obama's, faux progressive movement. He was one of the first to understand how to use the internet. Bernie later was able to organize doing that. Shame he was such a sellout. But at the same time, now the right wing watch that. The right wing, billionaire class watch that. They have people like Charlie Kirk. They have, they have a whole slew of people where they can dominate the conversation now. Yeah. They're the ones reaching young people. They have the money to go to college campuses like Kirk had.
And I noticed they're not talking about class, Phil. They're not explaining how the ownership class, has political and economic interests that are the opposite.
Yeah, but we don't have, what I'm saying is we lack the funds right now. We have to find a way to, like, for example, when the 60s broke out, who I've talked about before, that there was a way that the CBS Evening News, even though Walter Cronkite is called a liberal, the NBC News, or all that, they were still corporate organizations. But there was a movement, unlike the artificial movements like the Tea Party or Charlie Kirk or MAGA, that are all
no kings.
Exactly. So we have to find a way to this is what I was getting into talking about ancient Greece. We have to tell a compelling story, because I was saying the Greeks were a multicultural society because of their empire. They had a goddess Hera moving their father figure. Talk about nationalism and father figures. Well, the original one was Daddy Zeus. The Greeks believed he lived in their solar plexus, solar being the father, being the son. So this idea that they were dealing with multiculturalism with the polis of Athens, with the city state being this new thing, and they had spontaneous myths, as was the story, like I mentioned before, where the way of the Jesus movement started, because they were crushed under the Roman iron sandal, and the Maccabean approach was no longer working. The Maccabeans, who had run the Greeks out, had run the Assyrians out. It's practiced with Hanukkah to this day. When they tried to face the Romans that way, they were crushed. So this new mythos came about as far as what we see as the Jesus movement, which of course was transformed by the Greek Paul. But at the same time, we've got to come up with a spontaneous story, as in the 60s, of what was called counterculture, that was transformative and brought things leftward for a while. And this is, like I said, the right can do this with AstroTurf because they have money behind it. But where's the money for your podcast? I have my subscribers on Substack that do help out, but I don't have the ability to market myself, as the podcasters on the right have. Or the liberal podcasters also.
And then the algorithms are configured to push eyeballs towards those people they want and away from those people they don't want. By the way, I did put a link to your Substack in the description of this video, so everybody can please check out Phil's Substack and fund him. Be a donor, platform him, because we do need more voices like that platform. Greg, any thoughts as we're all talking? And we're talking past each other to an extent. We're not really getting directly engagement into differences, but it's a bit of good discussion. We're all just talking about our perspectives and how we see things, and I think there's benefit to that. But Greg, you haven't said much. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
yeah, I feel kind of simple. I mean, I'm looking at this through just basic Marxist lens, that we're in a crisis that's been progressively getting worse since the early 70s. And contrary to our discussion, there is no left. There's two right-wing parties, and the more liberal of the right-wing parties literally has nothing to offer, because there's nothing really available. at this point in our economy. There's very little surplus to share. And so we are.
Well, if the billionaires all, of course, because there's surplus, we can find it. This is what Mandani's appeal is in New York, is he pointed out the obvious. That Como.
There's class war that's going, but there's also, wages stopped rising in the early 70s for the vast majority of the population.
And I think their economic system is getting it's coming close to its sell-by date. So not only is their economic system becoming more and more untenable, but you have these rising powers that are refusing to be, dictated to and subordinate to imperialist, to be vassals, really. So China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela. And so all of these stressors on the oligarchy are causing them to really try and figure out how they can crack down and save themselves and maintain their privilege and their power throughout the rest of this century. And so, again, I think we're at the very beginning of this process, and we haven't even seen what their response is. And look, I always say this because I think it's really true. Once the market closes today, we could see this process really advance with an attack on Venezuela. Like that could happen when the markets close, for the weekend, because that's typically when they like to do these aggressive moves, because they don't want to spook the market. That gives them the weekend to talk about and tell it, relax. These are our goals. These are our objectives. You don't need to get scared. And then come Monday, you're going to have less of a volatile effect on the markets. But, it remains to be seen. So with Bannon talking about Trump in 2028, we've only had a year and we've seen some crazy stuff. Like, we don't know what's going to go in Gaza. We don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine and Venezuela and Iran. Like, there's so many spots. And then China, China's the big one. And so all of these things are causing a lot of stress, and they're in play, and they're going to be in play in the next couple years. And it's just going to be very interesting to watch them unfold and to discuss them. Phil.
I heard somebody mention the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes.
This is what happens with empire. Overreach. I mean, classic overreach abroad rots from it. There's no core, and it collapses into its center. The only problem with that is fascists being organized, MAGA being organized to the degree any countervailing movement is. There's a tendency for the bodies to stack up like corkwood. This, and it is tragedy. And new epics. When you have this weirdness where Congress is talking about UFOs, what are they really talking about? They're talking about a way that we are trying to connect with a new archetypal reality that is not literal, of course, but it is a way that we know, even the right knows these paradigms don't work. Unfortunately, the fascist right is to bathe the landscape in blood. And there can be there's purpose that happen from the left the same way, but so this is what I think the tragedy we have to avoid, and it is a root of my despair at this point, because there is a tendency, as you said, that the right does overreach, and one of the ways is, I don't know what kind of resistance they're going to meet in Venezuela. I think they're probably going to use drones and aerial bombardment the way the Israelis did to a large extent in Gaza. And I fear that's going to be their model, is the death cult that MAGA is, and Hegseth being who he is, and Miller being who he is, and Trump being who he is. They admire what Netanyahu has done. And so I do have, and I hope it's a paranoid fear that comes out of my Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. That goes all the way back to the Crusades. There's a thing called the Ashkenazi bottleneck that the Crusaders came through, and that's why all Ashkenazi Jews are fourth or fifth cousins. Fortunately, I have some Sephardic blood from my great grandmother from Spain, but at the same time, the history does seem to be wrought this way when you have this Crusader class trying to expand their empire as it collapses. And this is my biggest fear insofar as Venezuela goes. I hope there can be a formidable resistance, as the Viet Cong were. America should have lost that. I remember being in a movie theater in the 1980s watching Rambo 2, And Sylvester Stallone is, are you going to let us win this time? You know, there was this ridiculous idea of the humiliation that empire experienced that comes back with this Nazi fantasy that's been existing in the United States and has been building since the humiliation of Vietnam, because we did not learn the lesson of imperial overreach.
Well, so there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, question, you know, because Phil, what you're saying, I mean, I see a lot of people saying that, you know, it's the rise of Hitler, it's the rise of fascism. I mean, it's just where, I guess my question is, where are the fields of blood?
Well,
you know,
they could very easily, these fields of blood are now taking the form of, you know, priests and being pepper sprayed in the face in the streets of Chicago. This is what happens first. I mean, first you get the street fighting that happens under the brown shirts. You get the, you know, these disillusioned soldiers coming back from the great humiliation. You know, the French and you know were mining German. They were mining German ore right out of the country. The population felt humiliated and hurting, and it started with street brawls between leftists and socialists. Well, right now we don't have an organized left, as I've mentioned many times. You know, we don't even have a left. We have so internalized capitalism that people think, you know, most people conflate leftism with liberalism. And then socialist, you know, the idea of even saying socialism, which I think the deprivation that people, like I said, I lived in New York for many years. My wife and I left because, you know, to pay our rent, we were just having to just work far too hard. And so the people in New York have experienced what the rentier class is able to do, you know, as far as like Mondani's saying he's going to freeze rents. And this has caused, you know, this has caused hysteria on the right. But the people in New York get it living under this. But this is what, you know, what Trump is going to react to this is he's going to send, you know, there were troops in lower Manhattan yesterday. And like you were saying, we don't really have that yet. We do not have the Free Corp entering Munich and killing 50,000 leftists. But I think there is that. We don't have 50,000 leftists in the streets.
That's true. So we're at the very beginning of this, you can say that the fields of blood are in Gaza, are in Ukraine, but that's nothing new, right? Because that's the normal fields of blood. You know, the idea that we're going to have even more blood than normal, you know, is definitely probable. I just say we haven't, you know, experienced it yet.
Well, I had to go out in my backyard when I was a child. I'm in my mother's house now. So I said, when we're doing it, I can find Confederate and Union shell casings if I look hard enough. I can find Creek arrowheads. So the area I am in now, the Creek Indians, were ethnically cleansed from with the help of the Cherokees before they ethnically cleansed the Cherokees. And then this great, you know, this great upheaval. The land that where I'm sitting right now, actually, I'm off of a place called Briarcliff Road, which is the highest place in the neighborhood where the Coca-Cola family has their mansion. And my family's 50s house was built in, you know, down a ravine where nobody wanted land, and they were developing it after the Second World War. I'm sitting where the Candler family's elephants and monkeys were right now, as far as the ruling class goes of Atlanta in the highest elevation. But you go to this highest elevation, you can see monuments to Civil War battles. So we are capable of great bloodletting, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Sure. And so this is not unknown to human nature, and more common than we want to believe. It hasn't shown up now because there has been a certain amount of bourgeois affluence. You know, like right now, the little faux ranch houses are coming down on my mother's street, and they're putting up McMansion style modernist stuff. Because this is an area, I went to high school. My high school was included the Driving Miss Daisy neighborhood that you see there. It also included this working class enclave for rednecks and Holocaust survivors. There were 3 people that were Auschwitz on the street of little houses. There was a working class neighborhood called Medlock. You had the Scott-Irish name There were locks in this place where we're filled with working class people. There was a black neighborhood called Scottdale, which was a former mill town, and so this high school. I remember dropping off a girlfriend. I was 19. It was the summer she was 18, and her parents that lived in driving-less Disneyland okayed the relationship, even though I lived on the wrong side of Briarcliff. But see, there was enough for though my a girlfriend.
Did they know you were Jewish, Phil?
What? Well,
Did they know you were
in this neighborhood, there was a Jewish aspect of Atlanta
Okay.
because Atlanta was redlined where Jews lived in a certain part of it, and this was a part where Jews could live. So there were Jews in my high school, there were Jews in my elementary school. But my Catholic girlfriend that lived in Medlock. There was enough affluence that her father, who was a construction worker, he went to the point where he got promoted so he could sit in the trailer more of the day. But she had dental care. She had health care. She thought she had a future in front of her, and they just didn't think about Jews. They didn't think, it didn't even come into their mind to blame anybody. She was brought up probably not to date black men, even though she wasn't a bigot. But it was at the same time, it just was one of those kind of things where the working class, because of the New Deal, they were bribed enough to allow things to deteriorate, because Nixon is on tape saying, we got to make things harder on these people. That's where the hippies came from. That's where the war on drugs happened. The war on drugs has been a war that Nixon initiated to get rid of hippies and have a war on black people. So when Reagan came about and neoliberalism that started under Carter went into this, exponential trajectory, this is where the discontent of the working class comes from, because there's just not enough crumbs falling off the working class's table, and so this is where, this is where now I agree with everybody on this panel. The problem is, since I've been back in my old neighborhood, the working class people that remained, and I don't say this lightly, and it causes me much suffering, they are fascist adjacent. They are like the people that my family talked about their neighbors were. I visited my family house in Berlin that was stolen. There was one family on the street that helped Jews, and Churchill killed them with an RAF bombing. But they watched their neighbors suddenly change, they did accept them as Jews before, turn into Nazis. So, atavistically, I know this can happen anytime, any place.
You're muted, Billy.
But that there can be a fascist uprising, and the signs, I hope I'm being paranoid. I hope this is out of my DNA, some kind of paranoia that's coming about. But I know, since I've been in the States recently and reconnected to people I grew up with, people that are MAGA now, for various reasons, it is because of the resentment that you were alluding to earlier of the management class, more and more coming people that weren't supposed to have that entitlement. And they feel like they're being excluded. And they're also aging, and mortality does that to us too. There's a time where, my son, my son has to explain to me what 6'7" is, and skiddly rib.
I've been asking my kids to tell me that. They don't want to explain it to me.
It means nothing. It means something that came out of the height of a basketball player in a song about it, and a geeky kid making funny hand motions going 6'7", 6'7".
Okay, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think probably our parents thought the same thing about our jokes when we were kids.
Oh, absolutely. I remember being in long-haired cars with our 8-track tapes blaring Skinner or whatever obnoxious music was coming through, and enjoying the old people looking at us and looking over us, smugly looking at them and going, "Yeah, you'll be dead soon. It's our world," right? It's like, and now I'm in that position where young people are looking at me that way, being
so, got some commenters are asking about Carlo. Our other co-host is Carlo Parcelli, and he was just not feeling well. He had a cough, and he didn't want to join us and deal with the coughing, because that can be a bummer, on the audio. But hopefully he's feeling better and back on Tuesday. Thanks for asking about him. and he's also a poet, Phil, and probably in your same generation. So yeah, I'm a little disappointed he wasn't able to join us, but we still had a good discussion. And I don't know if anybody has any final comments before we wrap it up. We're almost hitting 2 hours. Any final thoughts? Greg, Ian, Phil?
Well, I think I've gas bagged enough.
Okay. Yeah. Did we lose Phil? Is he frozen?
I'm not frozen.
Okay.
I seem to be moving.
You're there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So yeah, check out Phil's Substack. Thank you so much for being our special guest, Phil. We will reconvene on Tuesday. Thank you, Ian, for co-hosting with me. Thank you, Greg, for being our other special guest. We will see everyone hopefully next week. We'll
Thanks,
see you
Phil.
then.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.